The sun was setting over New York, casting long shadows across Manhattan's skyscrapers. On the 50th floor of one of these steel and glass giants, Eleanor Blackwood looked out over the city she had once sworn to conquer. His eyes, once full of ambition, now carried the weight of a lifetime of difficult decisions. All this, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling, and for what? Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the memories flood her mind. The smell of fresh bread from your parents' bakery. The sound of coins clinking in the savings jar. The rough feeling of the first dollar he ever earned, rubbed between his fingers until it almost wore away. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion, "you were wrong. Money doesn't bring happiness. It brings loneliness." A sob escaped your lips, echoing through the empty office. Eleanor turned around, staring at the framed photo on her desk. 3 smiling faces looked back at her, her children, Thomas, Sarah, and Michael. So young, so full of life. So far away now. "My babies," she whispered, touching the glass with trembling fingers. "What did I do to you?" The tears began to fall, staining the impeccable Armani suit she wore like armor. Eleanor slumped into the leather chair, the weight of her choices finally crushing her shoulders. "I just wanted to give you everything I never had," she spoke to the photo, her voice cracking with pain. "But in the process, I lost you." The silence in the office was deafening, punctuated only by Eleanor's muffled sobs. She picked up a pen, her hands shaking as she opened a locked drawer. From inside, he took out a thick document, his will. "Maybe," she took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in her voice, "maybe it's not too late to fix things." Eleanor began to write, each word a confession, each sentence a plea for forgiveness. The hours passed, night fell on the city that never sleeps, but Eleanor continued, pouring her heart and her fortune onto the pages before her. When the sun rose, he found Eleanor still poring over the will, her eyes red and swollen, but with a gleam of determination that hadn't been seen in a long time. "It's done," she said to the empty office, her voice hoarse but firm. "Now all I can do is wait, and pray it's not too late." Eleanor stood up, unsteadily, and walked to the window. The city woke up, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the top of that skyscraper. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, feeling the pulse of New York beneath her fingers. "One last chance," she whispered to herself, a lone tear running down her cheek. "One last chance to do the right thing." Eleanor answered the phone with shaking hands, her racing heart echoing in her ears. "Mrs. Blackwood." The voice on the other end was cold, professional. "This is from Dr. Hartley's office. Your scans have arrived." The world seemed to slow down around Eleanor. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "What's up, doctor?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. The tumor, it has spread. We have to begin treatment immediately." The words hit Eleanor like a punch in the gut. She staggered, holding on to the table to keep from falling. "How long?" she managed to ask, her throat tight. 6 months. A year at most with aggressive treatment. Eleanor hung up the phone mechanically, the silence in the office now oppressive. She looked at the will on the table, the words blurred by the tears she could no longer contain. "A year," she muttered to herself, the reality of her situation finally setting in. A year to right a lifetime of mistakes. With renewed determination, Eleanor picked up the phone again, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. "Thomas." His voice shook as he heard the surprised breathing on the other side. "Son, it's Mom. I need to see you and your brothers. It's urgent." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor could feel the hesitation, the hurt built up over the years. "Why now, Mom?" Thomas's voice was hard, but Eleanor could detect a note of concern. "After all this time." "Please, Thomas," she begged, the tears flowing freely now. "I know I don't deserve it, but it's important. I need to see you." There was a long, agonizing pause. Eleanor held her breath, her heart hammering against her chest. "Okay," Thomas finally replied, his voice softening slightly. "I'll talk to Sarah and Michael. We'll be there tomorrow." Eleanor let out a shuddering sigh of relief. "Thank you, darling. Thank you." She hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of hope and terror. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would face the ghosts of her past, the consequences of her choices. Eleanor stood up, walking to the window once more. The city continued its frenetic pace below, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the top of the skyscraper. "A year," she whispered to her reflection in the glass. "A year to rebuild what took me a lifetime to destroy." She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. Tomorrow would be the hardest day of his life. But it could also be the beginning of something new, something precious. Eleanor opened her eyes, staring at the city with renewed determination. I won't waste this last chance, she promised herself. The sun was beginning to set again, painting the New York sky with shades of orange and pink. Eleanor watched the spectacle, feeling each second pass as if it were the last. The sound of the elevator announcing its arrival at the 50th floor made Eleanor start. She turned around, her heart beating frantically against her chest, as the doors opened. Thomas, Sarah, and Michael entered, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. My children, Eleanor whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She took a step towards them, but stopped, uncertain. Thomas, the oldest, was the first to speak. Mom, he said, his voice cold but his eyes betraying a spark of concern. What's going on? Why this sudden meeting? Eleanor felt the weight of years of neglect and distance in every word. She took a deep breath, trying to find her courage. I've made so many mistakes, she began, her voice shaking. But now, I need to make things right. Before it's too late. Sarah, always the most emotional, frowned. Too late? What are you talking about, Mom? Eleanor felt tears begin to form. I'm sick, honey. Very sick. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael, the youngest, always so quiet, was the first to react. He crossed the room in long strides and hugged Eleanor, surprising everyone. Mom, he murmured, his voice breaking. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Eleanor returned the hug, tears now flowing freely. I just found out, honey. And I realized how much time we wasted. Thomas and Sarah approached, their initial hostility giving way to concern. How long? Thomas asked, his voice now soft. Eleanor swallowed. A year. Maybe less. Sarah let out a choked sob, joining the hug. Thomas stood still, visibly struggling with his emotions. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Eleanor continued, her voice shaking. But I want to use the time I have left to try and make things right. To really get to know you guys. Thomas finally moved, joining the group hug. Mom, he said, his voice breaking. We always wanted you back. We just didn't know how to reach you. Eleanor felt her heart break and mend at the same moment. I'm here now, she whispered. And I'm not going anywhere. They stayed like that for a long moment, years of hurt and distance beginning to dissipate. When they finally separated, Eleanor guided them to the couch. There's something else you need to know, she said, taking the will from the table. Something that will change everything. As Eleanor began to explain, the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the office. The city continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the top of the skyscraper. But there, at that moment, a family began to reconnect, facing an uncertain future together. Eleanor held the will with trembling hands, her eyes roaming the faces of her children. The tension in the air was palpable. My dear ones, she began, her voice hoarse with emotion, what I have to say goes beyond my illness. It's about the legacy I will leave for you. Thomas leaned forward, frowning. Legacy? Mom, we're not here for the money. Eleanor smiled sadly. I know, darling. But what I did with our family fortune is part of what I need to fix. She opened the document, taking a deep breath before continuing. I gave everything away. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah was the first to break it, her voice shaking. Everything? What do you mean, everything? Every penny, Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. For charities, medical research, education programs. Everything except. She hesitated, looking at each of her children. Except what, Mom? Michael asked softly. Except the bakery, Eleanor whispered. My parents' bakery, where it all started. I bought it back. It's all that's left. Thomas stood up abruptly, walking to the window. His rigid posture betrayed the storm of emotions he was struggling to control. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why now?" Eleanor stood up, staggering slightly. Sarah ran to support her, and together, they approached Thomas. "Because I realized," Eleanor began, her voice gaining strength, "that I spent my whole life chasing the wrong thing. I thought money would bring us happiness, security. But it only kept us away." She touched Thomas's shoulder gently. He turned around, revealing teary eyes. "The bakery is our true legacy," Eleanor continued. "It's where we learn about family, hard work, love. That's what I want to leave you with." Michael joined them, his voice soft but firm. "But Mom, what about your treatment? You need the best doctors." Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that brightened her tired face. "I set aside enough for the treatment. But the rest is for starting over. For you to start over." Sarah sobbed, hugging Eleanor tightly. "Mommy, we don't need money. We just need you." Thomas finally turned completely around, facing Eleanor. "Do you really think we can start over? After everything?" Eleanor reached out to him, her heart overflowing with hope and fear. "I don't know, my son. But I want to try. With every breath I have left, I want to try." Thomas hesitated for what seemed like an eternity. Then slowly, he took Eleanor's hand, joining the family embrace. "The bakery," he murmured. "Where it all began." "And where can we start over?" Eleanor added, her voice cracking with emotion. As the Blackwood family embraced, the lights of New York twinkled outside, silent witnesses to a new chapter beginning. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of her children, the weight of the past slowly dissipating. The future was uncertain, time was short, but in that moment, surrounded by the love she thought she had lost forever, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "let's visit the bakery together." The aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee filled the air of the old bakery. Eleanor was sitting at a corner table, her wrinkled hands tightly gripping a cup of tea. His eyes, although tired, sparkled with a mixture of nostalgia and hope as he watched his children working together behind the counter. Thomas adjusted the oven, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong arms that now carried flour instead of folders of documents. Sarah was arranging a display of sweets, her genuine smile lighting up the place. Michael served customers, his soft, gentle voice echoing throughout the establishment. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming out all the time, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement. Eleanor felt a tear run down her cheek. "Dad, Mom," she whispered to herself, "you would be so proud." Suddenly, a wave of pain hit her, making her gasp. The cup shook in his hands, spilling some tea. Sarah noticed immediately, rushing to her mother's side. "Mommy? Are you okay?" Eleanor tried to smile, but the pain was evident in her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetie. I just need to get some rest." Thomas and Michael joined them, concern written on their faces. "Mom, maybe we should take you to the hospital," Thomas suggested, his voice shaking. Eleanor shook her head firmly. No. I want to stay here. With you. In our bakery." Michael knelt beside her, holding her hand. "Mom, please. Let us take care of you." Eleanor looked at each of her children, her heart overflowing with love and regret. "You're already looking out for me," she said softly. "More than you know." She took a deep breath, gathering strength. "I need to tell you something. Something important." The three children looked at each other, tension palpable in the air. "What is it, Mom?" Sarah asked gently. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. When he opened them again, they were full of determination. "I didn't tell you the whole truth about the will," she began, her voice shaking slightly. There's more." Thomas frowned. "More? What do you mean?" Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "The bakery isn't all that's left. There's something more. Something I kept hidden for years." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with expectation and apprehension. "Mom," Michael spoke softly, "whatever it is, we can handle it together." Eleanor nodded, tears flowing freely now. "It's about your father," she whispered. "And about a choice I made a long time ago. A choice that changed everything." The three brothers looked at each other, shocked. Their father had died when they were very young, or at least that was what they always believed. Eleanor squeezed Michael's hand, looking into each of her children's eyes. "It's time for you to know the truth. The whole truth." She paused, taking a deep breath, the pain in her chest now not just physical but emotional. "Your father." Just then, the bakery door opened, the bell tinkling softly. A tall, familiar figure entered, making everyone turn around. Eleanor's eyes widened, a mixture of shock, fear, and relief crossing her face. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The three brothers stood frozen, looking from the stranger to their mother and back again. Eleanor felt the world spin around her. The past and present collided violently in that moment, and she knew nothing would ever be the same. "Children," she said, her voice shaking, This is your father." Time seemed to freeze in the small bakery. Richard, the man who had just entered, took a hesitant step towards the family, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice husky with emotion. "After all these years." Thomas was the first to react, placing himself protectively in front of Eleanor. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger and confusion. "Our father is dead." Eleanor reached out a trembling hand, touching Thomas's arm. "No, darling," she whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "That was the lie I told. The lie that got us here." Sarah sobbed, covering her mouth with her hands. Michael remained silent, his gaze alternating between Eleanor and the man who claimed to be her father. Richard took another step forward, his eyes watering. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he began, "but when I got Eleanor's letter—" "Letter?" Thomas interrupted, turning to his mother. "What letter?" Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades of secrets. "I wrote to your father," she admitted. "When he found out about my diagnosis. He had a right to know." "Right?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice cracking. "He abandoned us." "No," Eleanor said firmly, mustering the strength to stand. "I pushed him away. I chose money, power, over our family. It was my fault." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor staggered slightly, and to everyone's surprise, it was Richard who supported her. "Ellie," he murmured, "you don't have to carry this burden alone. Not anymore." Eleanor looked into the eyes of the man she had once loved more than anything, seeing in them the same love and regret she felt. "I was so foolish, Richard," she whispered. "I wasted so much time." Thomas, still in shock, finally found his voice. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why now?" Eleanor turned to her children, her broken heart visible in her tired eyes. "Because I realized that true wealth is here," she said, gesturing to the bakery, to her family. "And because you deserve to know the truth before I—" She couldn't finish the sentence, a wave of pain making her double over. Richard held her tighter, panic in his eyes. "Eleanor!" he shouted, as his children ran to help. "Mommy!" Sarah sobbed, holding Eleanor's hand. Eleanor looked at each of them, a faint smile on her lips. "I love you," she whispered. "All of you. Please, forgive me." Her eyes closed, her body going limp in Richard's arms.
No.
Michael screamed, tears streaming down his face. Mom, don't leave us now. Thomas was already on the phone, calling an ambulance, his voice shaking as he gave the information. Richard held Eleanor, murmuring words of love and forgiveness in her ear. Sarah and Michael clung to their mother's hands, begging her to stay with them. The bakery, once filled with the aroma of fresh bread and promises of a fresh start, was now filled with fear and regret. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, approaching quickly. Eleanor opened her eyes briefly, looking at her gathered family. The truth, she whispered, is in the safe behind the portrait. The code is, it's our wedding date, Richard. With those words, Eleanor closed her eyes again, leaving her family in a whirlwind of emotions, with more questions than answers, and an uncertain future unfolding before them. The sirens arrived, and the bakery door opened violently. Eleanor's fate and the secret kept in the safe hung in the air, promising more twists and turns in this family saga full of drama and redemption. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel. New videos are coming out all the time, and you won't want to miss any of the excitement.